Hey everyone, it's Lori, and I'm here today with my wrap up for Nonfiction November. So, back in October, I set up my TBR and I picked two books for each of the one word challenges. And I had kind of hoped to get through all eight of those books, but the reality was I had enough other books that I was reading that didn't happen. But I did get through four, one from each challenge. So, this is what I thought of these four books. The first prompt was sport. And I decided to go with an actual sport book about this. I actually had two different football books to choose from, and I chose to reread Friday Night Lights. This is by H.G. Bissinger, and this is an older book. This was, I believe, the 25th anniversary edition, and it came out in like 2000 ish. Yeah, 2000 was the afterword. So it's not a new book by any means. I read this in college for our intro to sociology class, and I just found it very fascinating. And at that point in time, I was in a urban area. I grew up in the suburbs, and I never thought I'd live in like a really small town, and I do now. And so I do kind of understand a little bit more the whole Friday Night Lights concept. Our local school is very big into sports to a point that it bothers me a lot, to be honest. Um, and that's one of the many, many reasons we homeschool our kids, is because so much of the focus in small town schools is on sports and sportiness. But this book is fascinating because it talks about a small Texas town, and let's not say small. I mean, it's not a city, it's a town, but it's like significantly bigger than where I live. um, but and their football team is extremely good. Their high school football team at one of the particular schools in this town. It's big enough to have multiple high schools. Um, and this follows the team for a season, from their preseason all the way to the playoffs. So the author came in kind of just wanting to experience this, and he found all sorts of really not great things happening. And so the people in the town did not really like him very much after he published this book. But it's just such a good insight into what happens sometimes in small towns when you're dealing with small town sports, and the pressures that are put on high school athletes, and the expectations of what the sport is in their lives. So a lot of the different players had hopes of playing college football. A few of them did, a lot more didn't. There's some pretty like terrible injuries that happen, because they're playing at such a competitive level at such a young age. Um, and it talks about the stress of being the coaches and how basically if you are a coach and don't do well, you're run out of town on a rail. And it talks about all of the family relationships that these players have with their families and their relationship to the community at large. One of the fascinating things that I had forgotten about this was, and maybe it just didn't affect me so much because when I read this, would have been in like maybe 98. I think back in 98, I thought of 88 as a long time ago. And now I think of it as not very long ago at all. Um, but the kind of segregation issue, and this came up in two different of my nonfiction November reads, the segregation issue in schools, um, it, they recently had become integrated schools. They, at the time of this particular season, which I think was the 88 season, but it was like into the 80s before they had integrated the schools in this town. And then there was a lot of racial prejudice that was going on in the community as a whole at this point in time. And I'm sure they didn't appreciate it, the light being shined on them in that manner. But it was just fascinating because I think the difference is now that I'm older, I realize how recent that is. Whereas when I was, 18, I don't know that I thought that 10 years seemed like a lot longer when I was 18 than 30 years seems like now, if that makes sense. So, anyway, Friday Night Lights. I highly recommend this book. It was fascinating because this 25th anniversary edition has kind of an update on the players, or at least some of them. At least one of them didn't want an update. So you kind of find out what their lives looked like a little bit more when they became adults. So, very fascinating. Highly recommend this one. The second challenge was the word design, and I ended up picking up a memoir for this one. And this is called Yarn, Remembering the Way Home by Kyoko Mori. And I just had this sitting on my shelf. I think I probably picked it up at a thrift store or a library book sale, because that's where I get a lot of my books. And it is a memoir, but it's told in the context of knitting. Now, I'm a terrible knitter. I'm not very good at it. I do like to crochet, but she talks about her whole life from like her childhood to mid adulthood. I'm not sure exactly how old she is at the end of this memoir, but her mother committed suicide when she was young, and it talks about how that affected her throughout her life, and she had a very strained relationship with her father and her stepmother. So she left home in Japan and traveled to the United States for school. And then she ended up staying in America. And so she had a failed marriage that she talks about in here, and quite a few different career things. I mean, really, it's not quite a few. She seemed very stuck in a lot of her life. She just didn't want to make any changes. I think she was very much afraid of changes. And then there's also like her brother kind of comes in and out of the story from time to time, and he is just all over the place and doing all sorts of things, and she is just kind of stuck. So she does kind of break out of that towards the end. But as we go through this, she's knitting different things. At the beginning, talks about knitting mittens for her home ec class in, I don't know, grade school of some variety, and how she didn't do very well because they had to match, but they also had to mirror because, gloves or mittens or whatever she was knitting were difficult. And then she learns how to knit sweaters kind of without a pattern at one point. So we go through that. And then she goes through some different types of knitting, like the Fair Isle patterns and, the technique where you thread a yarn through, what is that? Intarsia, I couldn't remember that. But so she kind of tells her life story in the context of her knitting, which was fascinating. So it's not one that I'm going to keep around. I don't think I'd ever read it again, but it was worth the read. It's just not going to go into my permanent collection, so I'll probably swap this on paperback swap or something now. The next challenge word was voice, I believe was the term. And so the books I kind of picked out both had to do with parenting, and the one I ended up reading was Free Range Kids, Giving Our Children the Freedom We Had Without Going Nuts with Worry by Lenore Skenazy. I have no idea how you pronounce her name. She was dubbed America's Worst Mom for letting her 9-year-old ride the New York subway by himself. I think it was her 9-year-old. Anyway, people just totally freaked out. This is an older book. I've had this on my shelves a long time. I've been meaning to read it. I just haven't. I mean, other books have distracted me. So this was published in 2009, so it's 10 years old now. It was interesting. It talks about all of the different ways in which American children are kind of hyper sheltered, I guess, maybe. How parents are uncomfortable even having their kids walk to bus stops, and there are even schools where they don't allow the kid to get off the bus unless there's an adult there waiting for them. And we're not talking about like scary places, like just random suburbs. And kind of goes into how a lot of this just stems from the fact that we always see the terrible things on the news, kids getting kidnapped, whatever. So she also gives you challenges for how to be a more free range parent. So she'll give you like a basic thing, an intermediate, and then an advanced level thing at the end of each chapter. And one thing I found interesting is that this book is split into two halves. So the first half is like the kind of narrative. It goes through know when to worry, turn off the news, avoid experts, those sorts of things. And then part 2 is the free range guide to life. And it's just basically mostly safe or not, the A to Z review of everything you might be worried about. So, everything from cough medicine to Halloween candy to lead paint to sunscreen to, whatever. All sorts of things. So there's kind of an A to Z in the back. She has a very kind of funny sense of humor. It was fun to read because she's just kind of got this zany writing style. Is this earth-shattering or life-changing for me? No, but I don't live the sort of life where most of her tips are applicable. They're very applicable to urban and suburban areas, and my kids are older too, so had I read this back in 2009, Charlotte would have been 3. Now Charlotte's 13 and she's my youngest. So it was good, but not earth-shattering, and it's not one I'm going to keep in my collection. I'll probably also swap this on paperback swap. And then the final prompt was true, and so I went with another older book. You'll notice I read severely old books, but that's okay. And that's Savage Inequalities, Children in America's Schools by Jonathan Kozol. I know I have read a Jonathan Kozol book before. I don't remember which one. I would say I read something by him back when I was in college. So this was really interesting. This is all about schools, and this is also kind of that late 80s time period that Friday Night Lights is also in. So it just kind of talks about the differences between schools. So particularly talking about urban, poor districts that tend to be a majority minority, if that makes sense. That was a little weird. But anyway, so the schools in the urban areas tend to be a lot poorer. They tend to have a much higher percentage of Hispanic or Black students. You should say Black or Hispanic. He does focus on both of those communities a lot. There's at least one where it's a poor urban school of white kids too. So it's not exclusively race, but there's definitely a racial component to it versus kind of the suburban schools or the higher income schools in the same communities. So he's kind of comparing the two. And of course, this is in the 80s. So it's a very different world to what we think of when we think of schools now, in a sense, because so often schools are very high tech now, and back then, it was if the suburban school had 60 computers in a computer lab, that was really impressive, and then these urban schools would have 0 or 2 for the whole school. Basically, most of these urban schools were seriously overcrowded, and they received significantly less funding, according to this book, in terms of, and I don't know what all we're looking at. I've seen some different statistics on how these numbers are figured out, and whether it's just talking about local support and how much states prop it up or not. He does argue that states, in the trying to equalize, actually make the problem worse, because so often they give more money to the wealthy districts as well as money to the poor districts, and that just kind of makes the difference even worse. But some of the schools that he visited here, one was in an old roller rink, and many of the schools, they'd have multiple classes in one classroom space, or they'd have 6 classes going on in the gym or the cafeteria or some public space. Some of them didn't have cafeterias. Some of them flooded with sewage repeatedly. They didn't have paper. They didn't have books. Their library collections, if they had a library, would be 300 books or 800 books compared to 8,000 books at the higher income schools. It also talks about the fact that, well, technically they were not segregated schools. They were essentially segregated schools in the most part because of the way districts are kind of formed, and the fact that people weren't willing to do busing between neighborhoods in a lot of these, particularly suburban areas to urban areas. They would be unwilling to do any busing. And just the schools were just falling apart. So this was an extremely depressing book. I would love to read something more recent that tackles the same subject, because obviously this is looking back at the 80s, and that's when I was in, elementary school. So it was a long time ago, but I know that our schools are not equal yet, if that makes sense. Like, I know that different districts have very different availability of funds. One of the arguments that was made repeatedly in here was that more money doesn't equal better education, therefore we shouldn't fund poor schools more. And well, I would agree that throwing money at education isn't the end-all be-all solution. It was interesting how so often that argument was made to not fund poor districts better, but that argument wasn't made to say, therefore, wealthy districts don't need more state funds, because, it doesn't make any difference. So I do think this one's a pretty classic education book, and good to know about. I am going to look in to see if there's something more recent that is in a similar vein, because I would like to learn more about this. So those were the 4 books that I finished for Nonfiction November. I really enjoyed doing my Nonfiction November reading this year. I did find out that perhaps 1 book per prompt is enough for me, particularly since I always seem to have other books and challenges going. So I did read several more nonfiction books. So if you're interested in hearing the other nonfiction books that I read in the month of November, keep an eye out for my November reading wrap-up, which should be coming soon. Anyway, thanks so much for watching. Feel free to click subscribe if you like hearing about the books I've been reading, and I will see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.